Hello and welcome back to the podcast. I am super excited because today we have another super special guest whose work has made a big difference in my own life. So we welcome to the show today Willow McIntosh. Willow, I'm so excited you're here. Thank you so much for joining. Your podcast and your work has made a huge difference on my life. And with that, I want to turn it over to you to introduce yourself. And it would be great if you could mention your pronouns as well.
Certainly, certainly. Thank you so much. It's really, really wonderful to be here, and thank you for your lovely words. And yeah, I am delighted to dive into the topics today. My name is Willow McIntosh, and my pronouns are he, him. And I am the founder of Inluminance, and we specialize in helping HSPs to understand their purpose, neurodivergent people to understand their purpose and bring themselves into service in the way that is most authentically aligned to them. I'm also the creator of what I call the high sensory method, which is a process in how we can reveal our purpose as an HSP and if we're neurodivergent, and I'll probably talk a little bit about that today as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And just for some context, so as I kind of went on my journey to discover that I'm an HSP and later got an ADHD diagnosis, your podcast has made a big difference on my life and really has helped me guide me along my journey. So greatly appreciate your work. And I'm curious, you briefly talked about the work that you do to connect HSPs and neurodivergent people to their purpose. Can you tell us more about that work?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. So it really came about through my own journey, and I'm a firm believer that the area of life that we're most challenged by is usually the area of life that we are here to serve in. Nature doesn't make mistakes in that way. And that is very much how I began with my work. And I had to go through an experience of feeling really quite disconnected from my own identity and from what it really meant for me to be an HSP. And through my own training and through my own experience, I was able to reveal an ability that I had to feel the truth in terms of reading energetically when people are aligned in their truth and aligned in their purpose. And from that awakening and from that realization, I was then able to facilitate HSPs in a particular way to help them to understand that the way in which they're processing more deeply is actually aligned with the area of life that matters most to them. And then that in turn helps them to understand how their gifts are designed to create change in the area of life that matters most to them, and to help them to align with how they can do that in a way that really resonates for them.
I love that. And you briefly mentioned your own journey. And I was wondering because I heard you talk about it in depth on your podcast. And it's such a beautiful story. And I'm wondering, would you be open to sharing that story with our listeners here today?
Yeah, certainly, certainly, yes, yes. If I start saying a different version, then please just remind me, and or anything that you'd like me to dive into further. There's a lot to it, and I think probably the best place to start is really the experience that I used to have as a child, and I like to share this experience because I think it really helps HSPs to understand or to normalize the sensory experience that many of us are having when it does come to spirituality, and it comes to energy, and it comes to really connecting with something that's greater than us in whatever way that we like to describe that. And things really started out for me from a memory that I had as a child, where I was standing on the lawn of my family home. I was probably about 7 or 8 years old. And I can remember having this immersive sensory experience where I was feeling the color blue in the sky, and I was feeling the color of the fence next to me, either side of me in the garden. And I was feeling the smell of the grass in a way that immersed me into this flowing, energetic experience, which at the time just felt amazing. And I became conscious of the fact that I was a part of this benevolent, loving energy that was trying to do its best in the world, and that was much more intelligent and much more powerful than I was. And I could feel that I was a part of that, and I had a sense that my purpose at that age was to help that, and to, to be in service to that flow. And then, as we all do, we have to then face the realities of life. And the moment where I kind of turned in that moment in the afternoon, I then obviously went into my life, and I then experienced a series of experiences in my childhood that really closed that down for me, and meant that it wasn't safe for me to be in my natural empowerment and to really express the truth of who I was. And that was exactly as it was meant to be. And that allowed me to then go into well, I shouldn't say the word allowed, but it meant that I went into an experience of self-rejection. And I became very lost all the way through into my early adulthood. In my late teens, I was then able to change the environment that I was raised in, and I was able to then begin a path of trying to find myself again. And at the time, I didn't really know that that's what I was doing. I just knew that there was something profound in me that had been lost. And I knew that whatever I needed to do, I needed to reconnect with that again. So I then embarked on a journey abroad. I left the UK, I think it was in my very early 20s. Yes, yeah, in my early 20s. And I actually went on about a 7-year period abroad, where I was going to as many yoga retreats as I could, meditation retreats, and doing as much deep soul work as I could. And along that journey, I had an experience in a meditation center in Australia, in a place called Blackheath, where I went into a silent retreat. And the first stage of that retreat, it was called a Vipassana meditation, which some of your listeners may be familiar with. And in that first stage of these 3 days, the intention is for the mind to still and to quieten. And I remember sitting in the garden of this meditation retreat center between the sessions. And all of a sudden, in the stillness of my mind, I started to have that same experience again that I had as a child in the garden. And I suddenly remembered what everything was about, and I remembered like why I was here, and what was most important to me. And really, my journey began then for me to try to understand how I could really be in service to that. And it took me some time to really own my abilities and to get the right trainings and awareness of how I could use my gifts. And that then led me into the work that I do today, following the discovery of what it means to be an HSP, and the revelation of the power of our gifts and abilities, and what this sensory experience really means. And that then allowed me to begin to work with other HSPs to facilitate a similar process, so they can own their gifts and understand the meaning of them, essentially.
It's a beautiful story. Thank you so much for sharing that. And what I love about your work, and I think one of the many reasons I'm so drawn to your work, is that connection between being an HSP and feeling very connected to something greater and the universe. That is something that I really love, and I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yes. I think it's a really important part of who we are. As HSPs, as I say, what makes us different is that we are able to process the world around us more deeply. And really, what's happening when we consider that is it's an ability to see more deeply into the fabric of life. In other words, we're very good at seeing into the deeper circumstances when we're around other people, or maybe we're in a particular environment. But also what it allows us to do is when we're sitting in nature or we're sitting in a place of stillness, we're actually able to experience the deeper fabric of the natural world around us. And through the many years that I've been doing this work, as HSPs, we all talk about the same thing. We talk about this experience of feeling a stillness in nature, feeling the energy in nature, feeling the flow in nature. And that tends to then open us up to the awareness that there really is a greater energy behind nature. In other words, there is something that we can sense and feel that has a greater intelligence to us, a greater power than us. And rather than that being the type of thing that we might read somewhere or through religious texts, it's actually an ability to really feel that. And whilst it's quite difficult to really claim or really to find the right words to explain it, we have the ability to be able to connect more deeply in order to actually experience what spirituality and energy really means.
I love that. And I know you also you mentioned the work that you do with clients to help them connect to their purpose. And I'm curious, do you have any favorite tools, any favorite questions that might help listeners who are in search of their purpose?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's a very specific facilitation process that I take my clients through, and that always begins with the same question, and that is, if I was to ask you to share with me an area of life that has always deeply mattered to you and also deeply challenges you, what would you say that is? And through asking that question, it tends to allow us to think about, oh, wait a minute, what is this area that's always been there for me? And we tend to then go back either into our childhood, or we look for an area of life that we always want to talk about, or an area of life that just doesn't seem to leave our heart and minds. It's something that we want to pursue. And it's very often an area of life where we see an imbalance. And it's an imbalance that we've usually seen ever since we were a child. So, for instance, if our fascination or enchantment, as I call it, might be in the area of relationships, then what would have happened when we were younger is we would have been observing how the adults around us would have been interacting, and we would have noticed how adults get it wrong, and when they're not being truthful, and when they're running an agenda. So what happens is that doesn't change. We just become more conscious of it, and we kind of develop more abilities around it. So for your listeners, it's important to become curious about that. What is this area of life that I've always been fascinated by? And what is that imbalance that I see? And that actually leads us to want to try to do something about that imbalance that we see.
I love that way of looking at things. So because I for the last several years have been on a journey of soul searching, and I've shared it on the podcast before, but it's been a wild ride of being in a research career, getting a PhD in research, to notice there's why my heart keeps telling me there's something else I should be doing, but at first being too scared to take that leap of faith and then saying yes to that journey. So I love the way you put it, that it's something that's always intrigued us, but at the same time also challenged us, because I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah, it's the same for all of us. You're not alone in that at all, and it's actually a very. What's helpful is to reframe that. Is often when we think about that area of life that really interests us. Sometimes the first response to that is, well, but I'm always having trouble in that area of life, or I'm actually quite scared to pursue that because it seems to be challenging for me. It seems to be big for me. But actually, when you look back over your life, you'll realize that you're incredibly experienced in that area because we're often faced with difficulties or challenges that we have to overcome, and we will have overcome a series of those. So, an analogy that I often like to use is that if you imagine that as a particular section of a mountain, and we're very, very used to sometimes going off track and then coming back and finding the way and getting stuck in the rain and getting lost. And eventually we find our way to a plateau which has an amazing view. And if we've spent many, many years on that section of the mountain, whilst we might think, oh, this mountain hates me and I can never make sense of it, if we come back down and we were to meet a group of walkers or mountaineers at the bottom of the mountain, and they were to say, do you know anything about this section of the mountain? We would say, I know a lot about this section of the mountain. So that is a way that we can reframe our journey to think, actually, I am really experienced in this area. Even though I've been challenged, I've worked out ways to find my way back, and I've worked out ways to understand the journey more deeply and to understand the nature of the mountain more deeply. And it helps us to realize that we have a great deal of credibility, natural credibility in our area of expertise.
I love that. And the other thing I really love about your work is so because there's a lot of information out there about the challenges, the everyday challenges that HSPs and neurodivergent people face in their everyday lives. And I mean, yeah, and we live it. It's real. But what I love so much about your work is that you also throughout your work emphasize the gifts of being an HSP and being neurodivergent. And I was wondering if you could tell us about some of these unique gifts that we have.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And it's a really important area that you're raising there, Andrea. It's such an invitation to recognize that we do have a series of advantages and gifts, because the trouble is if we are identifying with challenges such as the overwhelm that we have to manage, the emotional reactivity, the fact that we do care about a particular area of life very deeply, and it can sometimes feel very confusing, the fact that we feel different sometimes, and how that can lead to depression if we are rejecting part of ourselves in order to fit in. If we are only identifying with those challenges, we are missing the greater picture, and we're actually really doing ourselves quite a disservice, because the invitation, or my invitation, is to recognize that we're actually gifted with a series of abilities that are intended by nature. So it's now understood that the trait represents 30% of the population. And that has always been in the human genome, right the way back to early man. And when we think about its purpose back then, we had an ability to be able to see into the natural environment more deeply, to notice subtleties in our environment, and to use that ability to support the evolution and the safety of the tribe or the community of people that we were living in. So, in other words, we would have been in communication with the leaders of the tribe. In some cases, we would have been the leaders of the tribe. And what that is allowing us to do is to support the world around us by using this ability to see more deeply and to experience the world around us more deeply. So what's important in modern day is to think about, well, how am I doing that right now? What am I experiencing more deeply? What are the things that I notice in my environment? What are the things that I notice in conversation? What are the things that I notice in the people around me? And to recognize that your perception has enormous value. And it's really important for us to learn the language and the ways to be able to communicate what we're seeing, to communicate the subtleties, and to especially pursue the area of life that does really matter to us, because we will find that we have an ability to bring a great deal of value to that area simply because of how we're experiencing it and perceiving it.
That is super interesting. And so because you also brought up the leadership piece, that some of us have been leaders of tribes given our unique trait. And I'm curious if you could expand more on that connection between being an HSP, neurodivergent, and being leaders in our communities and in our workplaces and families.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the leadership piece is another really important area. When you consider that one of the greatest aspects of a great leader is to be able to see the bigger picture of whatever it is that we're trying to achieve. So if there is some kind of project that we're working on, an HSP and the neurodivergent have an ability to be able to understand how that project fits into the greater context of whatever it is that we're trying to achieve. And then the ability that we have is to understand and see how each of the members of that particular project have their own unique purpose, their own strengths, and their own gifts and natural abilities that they're bringing to that project. So it helps us to see the bird's eye view of what the project is itself. Is that project actually supporting humankind? Is it actually fitting into the greater context of things in a way that is going to benefit the people who need it? And is it going to benefit the world at large? We can see that, we can feel that. And then we can look at the people that are actually going to be playing a part in facilitating the outcome of that project. And we can feel intuitively where they fit in and how we can encourage them to understand that their unique character and personality plays an important role in the pursuit of that project, and how we can support them to trust themselves and to own their gifts and abilities, and to bring everything forwards in a holistic way using that greater perspective.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm curious too. So just thinking about, because I've been through a huge professional transformation. I know others who've been through the same process. And just thinking about work and the leadership abilities we can bring to work teams and the work environment. I'm curious, and the nature of work is changing right now, but thinking about the more traditional model of 9 to 5 work, do you feel that those traditional workplace models are set up in a way that empowers HSPs and neurodivergent people to really hone and to really bring their unique skills into those spaces?
I would say at the moment, the greater percentage of workplaces are not set up to really support the neurodivergent. And I think a lot of the reason for that is because the leaders of organizations are not really either aware of the trait at all, or they're not aware of the benefits and advantages that it brings. So what tends to happen is we're thrown into the mix where we're expected to thrive in the same way that the non-neurodivergent do. And that does cause a lot of problems for us. So if we're expected to work continuously and to focus for long periods of time without an opportunity to recharge in nature or to be able to go and meditate, that's going to cause problems. If our environment's not set up in ways where it's reducing our sensory load, then again, that's going to cause problems. Unless we are able to take breaks and we're able to communicate our needs in a way that makes sense to non-HSPs, I think we have a responsibility to help non-HSPs to understand what our needs are, but also how our gifts complements theirs. In other words, if there's kind of an us and them experience in organizations, then that's going to cause conflict and misunderstandings and ultimately fear, which then causes problems. Whereas if we're able to say, I'm able to notice things in particular ways that are actually going to really help how you're pursuing a particular outcome. So if we work together in partnership, which is absolutely what the trait's designed to do, then I think we have an opportunity in organizations to help restructure things, to support HSPs to be in their zone of genius in a way where the non-HSPs understand, wow, this really benefits me. I can really benefit them, and we have much more of a partnership in that way.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, and I love what you said too about like the partnership piece and kind of like the collaborative side, because I've definitely seen that in my own life too. Earlier you talked about HSPs and neurodivergent people being very connected, very tuned in to the energy of the universe and what's going on in the world. And we are living in troubling times right now. And I'm curious if you have any words of wisdom to share with sensitive souls who are struggling right now.
Yes, yes, absolutely, yes. I think there's a couple of important distinctions here that help in this area. First of all, is that it's very normal for us to be concerned about how the world is getting on. That's the case for all human beings, of course. For us as neurodivergent people, we care really deeply about how the world is doing, the progress of humankind. Because we're so interconnected energetically, we do really feel how the world is doing more deeply. So for us to be concerned and for us to feel that is very normal. However, what I do find is important is to be very careful about how much we are allowing ourselves to be immersed in the media and what the media is telling us about the problems in the world. If you think about, if we think about the history of humankind and history of the world, we've always been in conflict and difficulty in some area. We haven't had a world so far where we've been in peace and balance. So I think it's important to recognize that we're in evolution in terms of our consciousness, in terms of our conscious evolution, and we are gradually moving towards peace and balance and learning to raise our frequency. I believe that that is a path that we are here to facilitate, especially as HSPs. But I think if we allow ourselves to consider, okay, this is happening in the world right now, this is happening in the world right now, this is typical of the type of journey that we're on, and the world is usually in some kind of turmoil. What is it that I can do to pursue my own purpose and to pursue the development of my own personal evolution in order for me to play my role in raising frequency? So, in other words, if we're allowing our own frequency to dive into the story that we're being told that everything is, going down the plug hole, rather than to disconnect ourselves from that storyline and say, okay, the world's struggling as it always is. I know that we're moving to a better world. I know that I have a role to play in that. How can I hold my frequency in order to support that? And in doing that, I think we have an opportunity to really disconnect ourselves from the pain of the story that we're being told. So, as an example, through the crises that have happened in my lifetime, the first was the recession in the 1980s that caused a lot of problems for my family, but I was too young then to really to have this wisdom around it. But the first real shift that I experienced was in 2008, where there was the credit crunch and the financial crisis. And I noticed how everyone around me was immediately going into this place of doom. And I thought to myself, do you know what? I could go there, but I decided to switch off all connection with the media. And I thought to myself, okay, what is it that I need to do right now to get myself back on track? Because I lost my business at the time. I lost everything in 2008 as a result of that. And I thought, you know what? I have carpentry skills. So I started to put leaflets out in my local neighborhood, and I started to get carpentry work, and I started to get work in existing building sites that were still going in that time. And I found my way through that. And then I picked things up and I just went from one thing to the next, one thing to the next. And I pretty much ignored what the media was telling me. And I did the same thing through the pandemic. I didn't sit at home playing Xbox thinking the world's coming to an end. I just switched off all access to the media. And and I worked on my business, and Inluminance actually did really well during the pandemic. And I'm doing the same thing again right now. So I'm not saying that we're supposed to be in denial of the struggles that are happening in the US and what's happening globally and politically. It's not as though we're supposed to turn a blind eye. It's to recognize that there's actually very little that we can really do, especially if we're in worry and in a doom state. The best that we can really do is hold our frequency high, maintain a connection with truth and love in our heart, and try to do what we can in our immediate vicinity to raise frequency and to raise hope, and just do our best as far as we can. And to remember that if something really bad happens, we're going to hear about it. People are going to tell us, hey, you need to take this action, like it was with the pandemic or whatever needs to happen. And trust that we'll know if we need to take particular action. But worrying and listening to the media and getting stuck into the story is not helping. That's not a way that we can really make a difference.
Yes, and I think it's a challenge, like in this age we're living in, because the news comes at you everywhere. And the other thing that I was gonna add too is, and that relates kind of to what you said, like taking care of our own frequency and energy, and taking responsibility for the energy we are contributing and sending out. Because I've always had the challenge of being kind of a type A personality, and feeling like my world's gonna fall apart if I don't work enough, and if I don't
Right.
check things off my to-do list every day. But more recently, I've come to realize, and it's a struggle, it's a journey, but I've come to realize, okay, I think of course, there's things I have to do to bring money in and to work, but I do feel like one of my main responsibilities right now is to take really good care of myself, so I can go out in the world and not be an additional and bring in additional negative frequency into the world, but really fill my own cup, really double down on self-care, realize when there's days or moments when I can't function like I want to, and it's more important to meditate or go on a hike. And that has made a huge difference for me, but it's something I consistently have to remind myself of.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I'm exactly the same. Yeah, yeah. So I have gone through periods of my life where it feels like I just have to push and stress and push and that's the only way that I can get things done. And from my experience, that doesn't get things done. I might get things off my to-do list and I might kind of push things forwards, but what happens is it's not actually in alignment with the natural flow of what's trying to take place. So when I disconnect myself from that and I go into an experience of of being mean to myself and pushing myself and driving myself, I'm actually disconnecting myself from the natural alignment that makes me much more effective at what I'm trying to achieve. So what I've learned to do is, as you've just described there, is I by being in a much deeper experience of self-love and alignment, and also understanding what my natural empowerment is, my state of natural empowerment. And that is very much, for me, it's in a place of grounded peace and calm, and also a place of trust in myself that I am going to be guided, that I do know what I'm doing when I really think about it, and that there isn't really an advantage to pushing and rushing, but there is an advantage to being in alignment with what I'm being guided to do and recognizing that there is a natural timeline. And by taking time out, as you described, to going for a walk in nature or going for a swim and realigning and shifting my state back into that place of trust and self-truth and guidance, then I find things move forward in a much more holistic way that has much better results.
I love that. And it kind of like, because we're so trained in our society to think in terms of productivity and work. But I love that reframe of like, okay, maybe like the number one responsibility is cultivating my own frequency and making sure the frequency I send out is light and not more dark. So I really love that. And this is such a great conversation, but I want to be respectful of your time. So before I let you go, I want to ask you two questions that I ask all of my guests. And the first question is, if you could tell us about a time the kindness of a stranger has made a difference in your life.
Yes, that's a really good question. A time when a stranger has made a change in my life. I think probably the most prominent example of that that's coming to me is when I was doing some work with an organization called the Mankind Project, which I really recommend for helping men to really face the shadow of our shame. And it's really an initiation process for the West, if you like. And I really came across that organization purely by chance, by a man that I met once who was kind enough to support me and listen to me in a difficult stage of my life, and recommended that I check out this organization, and then actually became a very close friend. But it was just his care and his commitment to wanting to help me, even though he didn't know me, and really there was no benefit, to taking the time to listening to my story. And that it just really helped me to see the beauty of our nature, and that we are all one, really, and that we're all connected, and we are all here to help each other. And that really helped me, it helped me to want to help others in that way too, to want to give back in that way.
I love that. That's a beautiful story. And then my final question is, can you tell us about a time you experienced a synchronicity in your life?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I was thinking about this earlier today. I think probably the most powerful synchronicity that happened was actually in that period of time when, in 2008, when I went through a very difficult period financially because of the recession that happened there. I lost my car, I lost my house. I had to file for bankruptcy. It was a very difficult time. And I actually ended up moving into a cabin that my parents owned in a field in Sussex. And I was sitting on the step one night. It had this amazing view. I mean, it was comfortable. They used to use it for kind of picnics and things on a Sunday. So it was comfortable enough to stay in. But I was sitting one day on the steps quite late at night, and I was really at this point in my life where I knew that I needed to make a change that was really in alignment with me. I didn't want to take time pursuing a business that wasn't authentic for me. I just knew that it was time for me to really commit to the work that I really wanted to do. And at the time, I had a phrase in my mind that was finding heart. I wanted to write a book called Finding Heart, and I wanted to kind of pursue this area of finding heart, which was really the basis to the work that I was going to do. And I just looked up at the sky and I said, universe, is it time for me now to pursue my work in finding heart? And no word of a lie, the shooting star went across my vision. I was like,
Wow.
okay, it's time for me to do that.
That is an
Yeah.
amazing story.
It was, I couldn't really argue with it. Yeah.
Yeah, hard to argue with that. That is a
Yeah.
beautiful way to wrap up the conversation. Willow, it's been such an honor to speak with you. Really appreciate you coming on the show. And before I let you go, I also want to ask you where listeners can find you.
Yeah, certainly. So if you would like to go to inluminance.com, sometimes it's difficult to hear the spelling of that. It's actually IN at the beginning. And you'll see the link in the show notes. But if that's a bit confusing, you can also go to highsensoryintelligence.com. And there is our website, and you can find out more information about what we do. If you're really driven to want to make a difference in terms of being self-employed as an HSP, then you're very welcome to book a discovery call with me. That's free to do so. You can go to the website and you'll find the link to open my calendar, and you can book a call there. Otherwise, there's other resources that you can find on the website. I would love to support you in any way that I can.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for the impactful work that you're doing. I just want you to know it has made a big difference in my life.
Oh, that's so sweet of you. Thank you so much. That means a lot. It really does. And thank you very much for having me here today. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks again.